Welcome back to another Q&A. The first question this week comes from Wes, and he asks, hyperplasia, thoughts? And he specifically asks, any research on this and that sort of thing, and if there's anything that I could particularly, link to hyperplasia. And, I believe that Dr. Jose Antonio, you could do a quick search, Jose Antonio hyperplasia study, and he does have some information on this. Now, just to kind of recap, hyperplasia is the splitting of actual muscle fibers. So we can have hypertrophy to where we have the muscle fiber actually grow in size, or we can have hyperplasia to where we grow the actual number of muscle fibers we have. And there's some research to suggest that this may actually happen. However, I think that at this point, my understanding of it right now is that, yes, it might happen, and we might notice some of these splitting of kind of muscle fibers. But we don't really know how to kind of train for it. We don't know the kind of implications of it and that sort of thing. So I think that, yes, absolutely, it could definitely be a thing that does happen. But as for practical recommendations on how you should structure your training program or different intensities and stuff like that to take advantage of potentially splitting the muscle fiber and having more muscle fibers, it's hard to say right now. And, interestingly enough, I think that, hey, maybe there's something to do with muscle damage that potentially helps it out. Maybe there's something to do with extremely intense sets to where you induce that muscle damage that could potentially induce hyperplasia. And, you do have the camp of people that love going to failure and taking sets to all out max, doing crazy negatives and stuff like that. Could there be hyperplasia from that sort of training? I don't think there's evidence for that. But that also doesn't mean that there's a ton of evidence against it. And I think that in general, if you kind of hedge your bets and you make sure to work in a variety of rep ranges, you still make sure to take sets to all-out failure every once in a while at the end of a mesocycle. And potentially you do perform eccentric type style training and implement some of these things throughout your entire macro cycle, then you kind of hedge your bets to where, if it is a thing, and we assume that we might get more hyperplasia from these different types of techniques, which is by no means clear, then you're probably getting benefits from it. But right now, I don't think that there's any clear-cut answers on, for one, whether it occurs through just regular training, if certain types of training help it, maybe stretching under load, does that help it? It's hard to say. But by implementing a variety of these things that we know can still lead to hypertrophy, just different kind of styles, might be a kind of good hedge there in case it does occur. All right? Question 2, how to deload. So my bread and butter deload is a deload every 4 to 6 weeks is kind of the sweet spot. So some clients, I just have a 3-week accumulation and then a deload that 4th week. Whereas others, I have a 6-week accumulation and the deload the 7th. It really depends on the feedback I'm getting from the client on their systemic fatigue throughout a mesocycle, how they're responding, how they're recovering, and that sort of thing. Now, actually, how to deload, my general structure is 50% volume or 50% sets the entire week. And then the first half of the week, we keep reps in reserve at 3. Second half of the week, around 5. In 80% of scenarios, that works really, really well. However, some people like taking that full week off. I'm okay with that. If that works better with someone's preferences and they just like taking a week off rather than having a legitimate deload, I am very much so okay with that. And theoretically, you can make an argument that physiologically it might be better to deload so you get some active recovery, you maintain strength a little bit better, you might improve insulin sensitivity a little bit by having those muscle contractions throughout the week. Could potentially help. But psychologically, it might be beneficial to just take a week off every once in a while. And I think that you might resensitize just as well with taking that week off. And as long as you're careful with easing in on volume coming back, which I would recommend regardless, then I think that the two kind of offset each other, and it really personal preference is what I like to dictate that decision the most. All right. But 80% of the time, half volume, 3 RIR, then 5 RIR. Sometimes I'll take the full week off, and sometimes I'll do 5 RIR the entire mesocycle. Sometimes I cut volume a little bit more. It really depends how someone feels coming out of that deload. Like if they're still feeling beat up, I might actually deload a little bit more next time and cut volume a little bit more, or have reps in reserve at 5 the entire week. The purpose of a deload is to drop fatigue so we can have productive mesocycles again. And one of the best ways to do that is cutting volume while also cutting intensity to at least some degree. And depending on the extent of how well you're recovered, might depend on the extent of how much you cut that training stress. So if you're not feeling like crazy beat up going into a deload, and your history tells you that you feel pretty good following a deload regardless, then maybe you don't cut that stress as much during a deload. But if you're feeling crazy beat up, you realize that you have a history of coming out of deloads and not feeling 100% fresh, then maybe you lean on the side of cutting that stress in the deload a little bit more via volume, reps in reserve, and that sort of thing. All right. Question 3. What do I think about prone curls for that forearm growth? And I think that I would much rather just train the forearms directly. And now, hold on though, because I'm not saying that you shouldn't ever do prone curls. Like, I still think that hitting that different variety of the bicep there, probably a decent idea. Hitting different portions of the bicep, not a bad idea. But for forearm hypertrophy specifically, I prefer to just train the forearms directly. I think that that is going to provide kind of the best kind of stimulus to fatigue ratio. Now, if you don't have a ton of time and you just want okay looking forearms and you don't have as much time, then of course, doing some prone where you have your palms down curls, not a bad idea. You kind of hit them both a little bit, but I think that if you're specifically wanting to grow your forearms, training them directly is a good idea. And I also think that there's something to be said that if you go the case of doing a ton of prone curls, you very likely don't get the best of either stimulus for your biceps or your forearms. So if you do a bunch of prone curls, well, you might be fatiguing your forearms a little bit before your biceps get fatigued, and that limits the stimulus per set for your biceps. But you also have that systemic fatigue from your biceps and that sort of thing, so you're also kind of limiting the stimulus for your forearms as well. So you're not really maximizing either. And to me, it's almost similar to where you try to do too many things at once regarding trying to do powerlifting and bodybuilding and trying to do these things at the same time, and you just don't get a great stimulus in either way. So I definitely lean towards the side of, hey, if you want big forearms, train them directly and don't rely too much on pulling exercises and curls and stuff like that, because for pulling exercises and curls, we want to really prioritize our back and our biceps. So using grips for pulling exercises to actually take those forearms out of it, I think is a better solution. And then doing a couple of sets of forearm work is a good idea. And it doesn't have to be crazy, like 2 to 3 sets of extension and flexion after your pull days a couple times a week. And that's at least enough if you've never trained your forearms before to see some significant growth. And, I just kind of want to look good. That is my goal with lifting. I don't plan to step on stage and that sort of thing. And for me, the most important body parts for just kind of looking good day to day, like when I'm wearing a shirt or something like this, is probably the arms, the delts, maybe the neck a little bit, the traps a little bit, and then the forearms. I think that those are the biggest ones. And then, yes, having decent back development, decent chest development, decent leg development, and good calf development, also think that that plays a role. But I think that if your goal is to just look generally good while you're doing day-to-day stuff, man, I wouldn't sleep on the forearms, the neck for some people. Like personally, I do a little bit of neck work, but that's more so for maintenance because when I played football in high school, I used to wear a helmet, so I had a pretty big neck, and I noticed that atrophied throughout college, and I didn't like that look as much. So basically, I trained my neck directly until I got it back up to a certain level, and now just kind of maintaining with just a few sets a week. But I do think that neck, traps, delts, arms, and forearms are some of the biggest muscle groups that make a difference for just looking pretty good in clothes day to day. And that doesn't mean that you shouldn't train your legs at all or anything like that. But depending on your goals, like it's going to depend how you allocate that stress. Glutes, probably still an important one. The ladies love those glutes. I don't know. I do think that allocating some direct work to those muscle groups probably isn't a bad idea, depending on what your goals are, all right? So hope that helps there. Question 4. If targeting small muscle groups, should you be in less of a surplus? Theoretically, I understand where you're coming from here. Like, if you're really focusing on just the smaller muscle groups, then you're not stimulating everything and maybe less of a surplus. And I do think that it's probably a decent idea, but first let me tackle the problem of small muscle groups. So I think it's commonly thought that isolation muscle groups are small muscle groups and more compound muscle groups are big muscle groups. To where in reality, if you look at muscle volume, like Brad Schoenfeld has a paper on this, I believe it was 2017. Search Schoenfeld small muscle groups. You should be able to see the paper. I believe it's free. And one thing that he points out in this paper is like the triceps by muscle volume is actually bigger than your chest, and it's even a little bit bigger than your lats, I believe. So just saying that small muscle groups is less of a stimulus, I think it's a little bit more nuanced than that. However, if someone came to me and they're like, hey, I just want to maintain my lower body and I just want to grow my upper body. In that scenario, should you be in less of a surplus? Well, I do think that would make sense because you're not necessarily pushing the lower body as much. But in practice, this is tricky because I already like having a pretty small surplus. I like about a 1 to 200 calorie surplus. And I usually like to see about 1.5 to 1% body weight gain per month for kind of more intermediate and beyond trainees. So it would be pretty tricky to go anything less than that. But if I was with someone that wanted to do that, we would probably shoot more for that 0.5% of body weight per month and slow things down just a little bit there. All right. So hope that helps out there. And the final question, what is my favorite memory from high school? So hands down, it's got to be Friday Night Lights, played football with my best buddies out there on the field. Like, that's hard to beat, man. Everyone always says like how much you're going to miss that sort of thing, and you don't really understand how much you do miss it until you come back. And a lot of people used to say that, oh, the thing that they miss is the locker room and being with their friends and stuff like that. And at the time when I was in high school, I was like, I'm going to miss tackling people and freaking the contact of it. I liked that. The aggression, I liked that. I'm going to miss that. But really, it's about being with your best friends out there on the football field, celebrating after the game with them. Like, as people, I think this is a big problem in society, really, to where as people get older, their friend groups tend to get smaller and smaller, and they don't or at least a lot of people, there's exceptions, of course, but a lot of people don't have that outlet of, talking shop with friends, giving each other shit, that sort of thing like that. That's really a really cool part of life. But before I get too philosophical here, I appreciate the questions. Drop any questions you have down below, and I hope you have a good weekend.